thank you so much for this introduction, and of course thank you to the gallery for this invitation. And I just want to mention that it's a little bit like a coming home. I did my undergraduate degree here at Concordia, just up the street at the Liberal Arts College. So that area is very well known, although it's changed so much. So un pincement au cœur, you know, where you think, oh, time does fly. But it's especially meaningful also because I guess the perspective that I take on natural resources, extraction, and industrialization, I think it really began through the kind of perspective that I received from the Liberal Arts College, where things are always looked at in a very interdisciplinary way. So it's a nice coincidence to be here giving this talk, because I think the book wouldn't have been produced without the time spent up the street here at the Liberal Arts College. So as we always do, professors always give one title and then change it when their conference starts. Looking at through my book and choosing what I thought would be most appropriate for this particular forum, I really wanted to focus more specifically on memory and visibility, and whose memory is visible in a landscape through these landscapes of resource extraction, and particularly hydroelectricity. So I'll focus, I've switched a few terms in the title. And I need to say also at the outset that my perspective is definitely cultural, you know, on hydroelectric development in the north. So I'd like to, I'll start briefly with the context of hydro development, which I think a lot of people in this room are already familiar with, but just give some of the key points to try to understand what are some of the themes that I'm trying to unpack in this cultural perspective on hydro development. And looking specifically at hydro development as something that produces a distinct cultural landscape, which is the hydroelectric landscape, which is a historically contingent production that belongs to a particular way of relating to this area that has been taken for granted in Quebec and many other places. But I'd like to give it a history and sort of look a little bit at it with an ethnographic approach, as a particular way of seeing this particular area. And then recently I've been more interested in hydroelectric tourism as a continuation, now that cultural landscape has emerged in the north, in James Bay and elsewhere in Quebec. There's people want to see it, people come specifically to see it. So there's another landscape that is expanding as a result of that, and talk about then the politics of making Aboriginal memory in these places visible or invisible through this new cultural landscape. So, hello. I just, as I said, I don't want to go over things that I'm sure people are familiar with, but there's one thing I think that we tend to forget that is really important to this historical and cultural approach I take to hydroelectric development, is the fact that in fact the whole of Quebec territory, the whole of the peninsula, l'entièreté du Québec, as Henri Dorion called it in his report in the 1970s, is actually a very recent creation. What we take for granted as the territorial space of Quebec is a little more than 100 years old. This was, of course, Rupert's land until 1870, when the Hudson's Bay Company surrendered its charter to the British Crown, and eventually after Confederation, there was a first extension of part of Rupert's land in Quebec up to the 52nd parallel, and this also happened in Ontario, and I can't get into the details of that. We'll focus specifically on Quebec. This wasn't unique. This extension of the territory of the province wasn't unique to Quebec, but I can't go into the details for the rest of Canada. So there were two extensions, one in 1898 and the last one in 1912 up to the Hudson Strait. So that territory is quite recent, and it's something that we need to keep in mind as we try to understand the construction of that cultural landscape. And maybe a second thing that is also, if we want to skip quickly through this historical period. A second thing that's also very important is that through this recent creation, this territorial expansion, what happens in Quebec in the 20th century, and this is my colleague, historical geographer Serge Courville, that has put it so well in his work. He says that the colonial axis, which used to be from east to west, now will be focused on a colonial endeavor from south to north. So historically, with the French colony, with the three bridgeheads, les têtes de pont of Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and Quebec, the settlement effort was to densify the space between these three bridgeheads. And this will be true for the first 200 years, pretty much, of the French colonization, the Laurentian Valley, the agricultural settlement. So with the expansion of the territory, we have a new colonial axis that will move north and that will adopt, I guess, a different kind of relationship with the land, and will focus specifically on resource extraction and most importantly also on hydroelectric development to enable this settlement, this colonizing of new areas. So it's a really important factor in order to understand what's at stake, why the discourse or the cultural landscapes around hydroelectricity are so symbolic, is that they are also involved within a process of nation building, as I'm sure most people are familiar with here. So with the Quiet Revolution, maybe one last thing also to mention is that this new axis of colonization is also an axis of decolonization for Francophones, for the Québécois. So through conquering, through occupying, developing that space, they are also expanding the state, expanding their own government, and affirming their more power in the province. So I just want to wrap up these few elements I want to put on the table before going to an analysis of the cultural landscape by making maybe more stricter historians might think I'm jumping too much over time here, but I think there's a real connection between the Durham report and a statement that has kind of reverberated through the decades, that is made about the inability of French Canadians to occupy their space, to make something good of the land that they're trying to settle. In comparison with the English, they're inept in many ways. If you read carefully the Durham report as a result of the Patriot Rebellion, you realize that the French Canadians are the natives in many ways. They just can't settle the land properly, so they should be assimilated. So in the 20th century, and these are the words of, I think the words are also very telling, he says, the question is, by what race is it likely that the wilderness which now covers the rich and ample regions surrounding the comparatively small districts in which the French Canadians are located is eventually to be converted into a settled and flourishing country? And at the time, Lord Durham is referring to basically the Laurentian Valley, so he's not imagining the whole of the Quebecois Peninsula today. But in the 20th century, I think with the Quiet Revolution, if you look carefully in the archives at the political discourses, you find politicians constantly answering in many ways to that call, that trying to prove that in fact the French Canadians were able to occupy and to develop and do it well. And Bourassa, better than anybody else, I think, framed his discourses, or whoever wrote them for him framed it in that way. In his book on James Bay, this was written in 1973, he says, the territory of Quebec remains to a large extent unexplored. While the Americans and Russians are involved in space exploration, there remains on our territory, very close to us and inside our frontiers, one of the most beautiful challenges that can be taken up, the conquest of Quebec's north. We must, it's very clear, the conquest of Quebec's north. We must reinvent the history of Quebec. We must repeat the courage and the will of our ancestors in the 20th century. We must occupy our territory. We must conquer James Bay. We've decided that the time has come. So it's really this will to occupation, you know, of the full extent of Quebecois space. So these are just some of the elements I think that can offer some lenses to try to understand the importance of the cultural and symbolic construction, not just of that territory, but I guess it's also important to understand that this is entered fully into the physical transformation of the region as well. You know, sometimes when you work at the level of discourse or visual representations, people say, well, you know, where's the materiality in that, you know? And the materiality, I hope I'll be able to show you through different examples, is everywhere. It really is. The environmental advisor to what used to be the Crown Council of Decrees is now the Cree Nation government, Alan Penn, put it so succinctly for me when he said that really what was behind the hydroelectric development of the Lagrand was that the technical approach to this river was to achieve the full use of the theoretically available hydraulic head of the river. So this river became the main axis of what would be a huge machine for producing electricity. And other rivers, the Kaniapisco and the East Main River, were also diverted to augment its debit. So everything was focused on the Lagrand River in order to maximize its ability to produce megawatts. So I'll be speaking about the discourses and symbolic sort of landscape around this, but it's important not to forget that this is happening at the same time as a very extensive physical transformation of this area is happening. So there's another book by Hans M. Carlson, Home is the Hunter, that is a really good look at how this physical transformation brings about a new way of seeing the region, because you're not embedded in the same kinds of landscapes as a result of this physical transformation. So for the Cree, there's been a radical way of a radical transformation also in the way of relating to their own land, their own territory. So I don't deal with this in my book, but I deal with how the physical transformation brings about a new way of seeing for the Quebecois of this region. And this new way of seeing is quite focused on the particular perspective of the viewer as opposed to the perspective of the people who inhabit this landscape. So I'll go on to look at some of these sites so that we can understand this dynamic, how this physical transformation that was also embedded in a historical discourse of colonization and conquest has sort of materialized a way of looking at this region that is really, really enacting the aspirations of the viewer much more than the aspirations of the people who live in it. And in order to try to understand these dynamics, I've used the work of Dennis Cosgrove, who is a cultural geographer. He's deceased today, but he was interested in the emergence of perspective during the Renaissance in Europe. And he analyzed very rigorously how the emergence of this new tool for representing people, objects, but also landscapes in particular, brought about a new way of seeing that brought about then a new relationship with these places. And this particular quote, I think I'll bring it back toward the end, I think applies very, very directly to what I think has been going on in James Bay since the 1970s. He says, for in important, if not always literal sense, the spectator owns the view because all of its components are structured and directed towards his eyes only. The claim of realism is in fact ideological. It offers a view of the world directed at the experience of one individual at a given moment in time when the arrangement of the constituent forms is pleasing, uplifting, or in some other way linked to the observer's psychological state. It then represents this view as universally valid by claiming for it the status of reality. The experience of the insider, the landscape as subject, and the collective life within it are all implicitly denied. Subjectivity is rendered the property of the artist and the viewer, those who control the landscape, not those who belong to it. So the hydroelectric landscape, I think, really brings us in as viewers, as spectators. I haven't included an example of the spectacular dimensions of that because the talk would be too long, but in terms of being invited as viewers, everywhere you find, when you look at the dams or you go to see the dams, you find ways in which they are presented as a picture. This is a few years ago, I'll mention quickly Maniksang because this is the Manicouagan project in Innu territory. I don't have time to go into it, but just to give you a sense of how this is organized. The first thing that you do when you go for the tourist visit, you sit in a room and they start talking to you about the history of the dam, and the whole time you see the dam sort of in frame. The room is organized so that the center of it is really you hearing the history of the construction of this dam and looking at the dam through a picture window at the same time. I could go back in the question period with these pictures of Innu hunters in front of that dam, but I guess I don't want to make the talk too long, but I put that picture there. So, this invitation, though, to, when you go as a hydro tourist, I'll go back to that at the end, but this invitation to be a viewer, to admire the spectacle, of course, you sense it very strongly when you go as a hydro tourist. But before we go to tourism, I just want to I still mention other ways in which, maybe more subtly, we are invited to be viewers, to control the landscape as external viewers more than participants in it. And in my work, I've looked at the gradual construction at the archives, how the James Bay roads were laid out across the territory. And this also brings in some interesting aspects of the reduction through the knowledge production about that area of other experiences with this land. So there's tons of documents about the surveying, which is also a quantifying and an organizing of the whole region. And I like this idea that the surveyor, this is, Dennis Cosgrove uses this image in his book, looking at perspective, and it's a way of organizing, space and making sure that you can know all of its particularities. So the surveyors in the Hydroquebec Archives, there's quite a lot of data there, and even the engineering companies took this model for representing their own engagement with the region. And this is one quote from one of the surveyors who says, "With our heavy, awkward instruments, our role was to measure distance and elevation to locate specific points on the ground. The guys from Hydroquebec were asking us to measure everything, from the highest point to the lowest one. We would draw measurement lines that started at the bottom of peat bogs and ended at the crest of mountains." So this collection of information was extremely, it was urgent, it was quick. They were under a lot of pressure to produce that information quickly so that Hydro-Quebec would have all the information necessary in order to know which rivers to dam first and have as precise as possible, all the information in order to be able to act quickly. And what's interesting to me is that nowhere in that process, Hydroquebec was always, I guess, very proud of the environmental science that was produced through their engagement with this region. But when you look at the way of acquiring this data, it's very interesting to see the lack of involvement from the actors in the landscape who actually had a good deal of information from hundreds and hundreds of years of interaction with that. But there's a real sort of narrowing down of what kind of information is going to be relevant for knowing this region. This is another example. This is a report that was produced by two geomorphologists that worked for a few summers. They worked for Hydroquebec, and their mandate was to name the landscapes in order to prepare for the inauguration of LG2. The idea for the inauguration was to be a very big spectacle. So they were bringing people along the road, but mostly flying people also. But if you take, I don't know if anyone has ever driven the James Bay Road to Radisson, there's a real cultural construction there in that you're driving the road and you're invited to stop along the way in order to kind of get some reading codes for what you're looking at as you're driving along the road. So there's these information boards, and you can read the information and then look at the landscape and have some means of deciphering this. So I was interested in looking at how this came about. It's almost like a book. As you're driving the road, you're being invited to stop along the way and to read the information and then to read the landscape as a viewer, but as an interpreter also, you're given some tools. So there's a history behind that, and I was quite interested to see how this came about, especially because there are other parts where I looked at some villages in Diabitibi who were really militaires. They were very active for trying to get the road to come to their area to bring a little bit of development. But the road, the siting of the road ended up being quite different. So these two geomorphologists, their mandate over 2 summers was to drive the gravel road that went, there was a gate there when it became Hydro-Quebec territory. So they drove this gravel road to Radisson, and anytime they felt like there was kind of a landscape unity, there was an interesting geographical feature on either side of that road, they would park the car, take their notes, take pictures, and this is the more important part, they would name that particular feature. So over the course of their campaigns over 2 summers, they essentially produced their own reading of this penetration road into James Bay, and they named different landscapes along the way. They chose what objects were important to look at, what kind of physical, geographical unity could be seen. And what they say in the report also is that they're quite honest to say that this is done mostly for people who are going to drive. So they say this data has allowed us to better situate within a whole that is ultimately the physical unit in the natural region, the different primary and secondary landscapes identified along the main roads that service the Haudissonnie. This was the name of the region that was given at the time. We must note that this identification was accomplished first and foremost from the road and mostly for its users. So constantly, there is this picture frame, the dams here, this is what you see. Then the framing of the surveying also, this is what you see, this is what you note. There's the framing of the grid that is used in the engineering, and then there's the framing even of the way in which this access road, what landscapes are going to be named. So, I mean, to me, this is an important cultural practice, because none of the hunters were invited, or the families whose territory this road was going to cut across, nowhere were they consulted in order to give the Aboriginal the Cree names for those geographical features. Today things are maybe a little bit different, but we would have a very different means of access to that territory had there been a collaborative process of these two geomorphologists with the people who are in the landscape, using the landscape, who have historically made it their own territory. There would have been a very different, I think, way of producing knowledge about that region. So just one last example before of that process of shaping that cultural landscape of hydroelectricity that will reflect our subjective approach or a particular identity position. This, I think, was crystallized in many ways, all these cultural practices of production of knowledge about the region. I think all of this became very real. These things may be a little bit more subtle. You drive along the road, you don't really question who has produced the information that goes on the information board. But people started, I think, reflecting a bit more with a bit more depth about this when the Toponymy Commission, la Commission Toponymie du Québec, and full disclosure, I'm a commissioner at the Commission Toponymie. I wasn't at the time. And it's actually surprised because I've written about this, and when they asked me to be a commissioner, I didn't think they had seen the article, but they saw it, and I still was invited to participate in the commission. But it's hard not to be critical of that particular initiative. And as I said, I think it really crystallizes the kind of cultural production of that landscape that goes on in so many ways that has accompanied the physical transformation of the area. In 1997, there was this initiative by La Commission. It was called a geographical poem. It was entitled Garden at the End of the World. And the idea behind this is that La Commission Toponymie does this occasionally. It does a commemorative project, and Montreal will have its 400th anniversary soon. Anyway, 360, yeah. And so we're La Commission is probably going to get involved in doing a commemorative project. Nothing of this sort, but this is something that it does regularly. So 1997 was an important date because it was the 20th anniversary of Bill 101, la Charte de la langue française. And so the idea, I'm not sure, it didn't come from a commissioner, maybe an analyst. The idea was to produce a geographical poem where 101 geographical entities would be named, and their naming, the names that would be chosen would be a way of celebrating the creation of Bill 101, the Charter of the French Language. So it's quite a challenge to find a geographical area across Quebec where you will have 101 entities that are not named, that are close to each other, and so that you can, give these new names. So where did they look? Of course, they looked to the north, and nowhere better than the James Bay Project. And so I just want to go back to the map here. They decided to name 101 islands in the Kanya-Pisco Reservoir here. This is the head reservoir of the whole Lagrand system. As I said, the theoretical approach, the technical approach was to make sure that this river had as much power to deliver as possible. So rivers were diverted, so the head reservoir has flooded quite a lot of land around it. And so in the reservoir there are numerous islands, so they named 101 islands in the reservoir with the title of literary works by Quebecois authors, a few in English, but the majority is in French. So it's a beautiful commemoration or geographical poem. it's all these poetic phrases, l'épouvante, le survenant, all these amazingly evocative names from literary, and there's a wealth of literature in Quebec, as we know. But of course, the Cree were quite shocked by that project, because these islands had been hills. They were not in the same physical environment prior to the submersion of this area because of the flooding to create the reservoir. So, to me, again, this really exemplifies that, the culture, the creation of a cultural landscape goes hand in hand with the physical transformation of the landscape. They're not separate processes. People will say, well, it's an economic resource exploitation. It's about economics. It's about development. It's about sustainability. It can't be separated, I think, from culture. Here you have something that the governments have always said, was an economic imperative. We needed to develop, but through the changing of that landscape, you can also very conveniently bring about a new cultural landscape, which in this case clearly is francophone and is really trying to assert a cultural presence when there has not been a sustained physical presence of southern Quebec in those areas. And that's colonialism. That's really, there's no other word for it. There is kind of a projection through imagination, through symbolic means of a culture into an area that it has not physically been invested in. So, this project was, it's Matthew Kuncombe at the time who wrote to the Minister of Culture, who was Louise Baudouin at the time, and sort of pointed out, and he used the word colonialism, which is not always well used. So I just want to finish, or used, widely, because everyone, is kind of, nervous about it. But I just want to finish then with what I see as something that is kind of adding another layer to this physical cultural transformation of the landscape, which is the tourism. And I think you have to grant that this is not a mass phenomenon. There are not like thousands upon thousands of people who fly to see LG2 and all that, but enough people are quite interested to drive that James Bay Road and stop and read the landscape and all that. That I think it's an important enough phenomenon. Same thing with Manic 5 and other dams that Hydroquebec invites people to come and see. So there's a real development of that hydroelectric tourism, and there's many shifts in the way of framing the discourse also. And one of them, I don't want to spend too much time on this and go and analyze some of the sites, but I find it kind of, ironic or kind of a little bit humoristic humoristic that for years and years you had to say that this area was so remote that the people who went to work there were heroes of the nation and pioneers and all that. But now if you want tourists to come, you have to say, no, it's not remote after all. It's actually very close. Like you open your door and you're there, So it's interesting when you pay attention to the discourses, you see how malleable they are depending on, what's needed here. So this is a brochure from the early 2000 about Discover James Bay, and come and see these. And, they talk about the Robert Bourassa Dam towering as high as a 53-story building, the world's largest underground powerhouse, 140 meters below the surface. Lagrand 1 generating station, which took 6,000 people to build. The colossal spillway, which is what you see here. These feats of engineering are sure to electrify you, and I'm sure someone's really happy with that sentence. I really, this is really catchy. So I wanted to look at this. This is the Lagrand 1 generating station, which took 6,000 people to build. So this is not a hugely spectacular dam, but I think it's one that is really, really interesting to understand. The physical remaking, which comes with the cultural remaking of this area. This is the LG2 dam. It's LG1. It's un barrage au fil de l'eau, so it doesn't, it's less, I don't know how you translate it in English, au fil de l'eau, but it's the current just runs through it and generates the power. And when you come to see it, you know, there's that belvedere that moves into the water. This is downriver, upriver. And then you can read these information boards that will tell you about the 6,000 workers, how many tons of concrete. That's always part of the information, how many tons of concrete, and shows you lots and lots of pictures of the site. But something that's been added since the first time I went to James Bay in the 1990s, I went back in maybe 2005, is now a kind of environmental site. There's been an added layer to the tourism, to the spectacular, the celebration of modernity and technology. Now the new addition to that is you can come and view sustainable development as well. So once you've admired this dam, you get in a bus that you're touring with, and they will drive you from this belvedere here to go see Lupition Bay and see the kinds of efforts that Hydroquebec is making for sustainable development. And the idea behind this is that they recycled the dirt that was dug out to create the dam was charrié, I guess, was transported in this area. And they made, this used to be a bay, and they made islands with this extra dirt and planted it with wild grasses. So the effort, I guess the idea behind the sort of environmental design of this was to create nesting areas for fowl, for birds, and you know, eventually, even if people wanted, they could maybe hunt hunt the birds in this area. But you read the information boards and you can see all the different waterfowl and different birds that have come back, supposedly. But I read there were 2 reports on the success of this initiative, and biologists were not very conclusive. They didn't think that the birds had really kind of taken to this Lupition Bay. But its part, I guess its main purpose is to serve the representation of sustainable development. So whether the birds have come back or not, from Hydroquebec's perspective, you know, the effort was probably useful. But again, I want to point out to the physical transformation and cultural transformation, which go hand in hand. What's interesting is that this place name, Lupition Bay, actually, Lupition means in Cree, it means first rapids. So there's a real kind of misnomer there, you know, if you're a strict toponymist, you know, it's kind of funny to be referring to a bay, but to use the Cree word for first rapids, you know, it's not the same geographical entity. But they took what used to be the name for this area. Originally, when the Cree signed the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, they didn't want the dam to be at this particular area because those first rapids were a place where inland people, mostly coming from Kaniapisco, and coastal people would gather at the end of the summer. They would fish, they would dry the fish, they would get berries around, so they would get provisions for the winter, and then the coastal people might go back to Fort George or down the coast, and others would go back upriver to their inland territories. So this was a very important heritage site for people, and they asked in the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement that the dam be located 40 kilometers upriver so as not to destroy that site. Eventually, they agreed to move their village from the island of Fort George to the mainland, and the governments took this opportunity to reopen the question of the siting of LG1. And eventually, I won't go through all the archives I've looked at. You could see how the negotiation happened. But eventually, they agreed to the village, and Hydroquebec was able to move the dam back to its initial planned location, which is Lupition. So that site does no longer exist. When you are looking at the dam, you are looking at those rocks, or essentially the rocks, although on the other side, but these are kind of the flat rocks that, so they're there, but there's no information board, again, about this. The people provided me with numerous pictures. There's a heritage, Fort George Heritage Center, and now the Cree Cultural Institute. These are the kinds of archives that they've gathered to keep the, the iconography of these sites. But that's not integrated into the information boards, but the name is used, but I think as a misnomer. So anyway, there are numerous testimonies about that site in the Great Whale Environmental Impact Assessment a few years later, when the Great Whale project was announced, and there was an assessment of the impact. And one person, I think, puts it very well. What is a spectacular landscape for one type of viewer is a landscape of fear for the person inside who knows that place from a different cultural experience. So this person says, I saw Lupition LG1 also. I didn't want to cross over to the other side because I was afraid. I'd never crossed at a place that looked like that. I was too scared when they wanted to drive across the dam. We had to turn back. There used to be so many people there. They pulled in nets. You can see that place at all when I saw it. People got so many fish there. People dried fish for the winter. Today, it cannot be done at all to hunt there. So there's very different perspectives, which, people agree to this dam. There should be a way to represent multiple perspectives in the way in which we read that site. But we haven't, we're trying, but we haven't found a way to integrate that. So I just wanted to go back before I close with just, I don't want to close on I want to close on more upbeat examples also. But I think it's really important to maybe go back to Dennis Cosgrove in those examples. It's really a good, when you look at these sites, you take them apart, you look at the archives and see how they were created, how they were constructed, and we take them for granted, but they came into being because they were made through different cultural practices. You really see that the experience of the insider, the landscape is subject, and the collective life within it are all, in this case, I don't think very implicitly denied, but outwardly denied. Subjectivity is rendered the property of the artist and viewer, those who control the landscape, not those who belong to it. So there's a real sort of political position to be the viewer here. And Fikret Berk also, I think, says something very important about the development, in relation to the development of that sustainable development sort of visual surface of these sites also. He says, simplistic mechanical ecology, in fact, does not capture the relationships of people in the environment and the deep feeling that people have for their environment. You can call it Opishiwunbe. First of all, it doesn't make sense geographically, but the ecological design of that new site does not make sense for the way, in relation to the way in which this site was used. So, how do we make the insider's experience of the landscape more visible? And this is what, in a new project that I've had with students in the community of Mastoyash, we've been trying, and also Pessamit, we've worked with the Innu. I was showing Manic 5 before, and I had always wanted, when I started working on James Bay, I was always interested because Manic 5 was so much the engine of the Quiet Revolution on the Manicouagan River. But in the last few years, I've been working with Mastoyash, and it's also interesting that one of their heritage rivers, the Péribonka River, has really been the engine of the development of the aluminum industry in the Lac Saint-Jean area. So in the same way that Lagrand was really the backbone of the Quiet Revolution and the development of Quebec, even regionally, sometimes you have these heritage rivers that are very extensively used by Aboriginal communities that become really the main, the backbone of this economic development, and none of that heritage is part of the picture. So we've worked with the Péribonka River, which is in the Lac Saint-Jean here, and Massillage is here, the Péribonka goes this way, and it forks with the Manouane River. And the people in this area from Essipit and Pessamit, they would go up the Manicouagan, the Bersimis, the Outard River, and all, you know, when you look at the territory from the point of view of the river landscape, you see the cultural connections between the different communities. So we've looked at the Péribonka River and its hydroelectric development, and the most important thing about this experience for me as a researcher is that the development has happened over a period of 100 years. So whereas James Bay, the first phase happened, you know, in barely a decade, these people have experienced the relocation, the transformation, the re-territorializing, and the loss of cultural heritage sites over a period of 100 years. So we started to try to understand some of that. But the first dam is in 1912. The last one is 2006, its inauguration. So it's a long period of time. And the last one is Péribonka 4, Péribonka 4. And this is the Péribonka River. This is the Manouane River. And this is what people used to refer to as the forks. And in doing this work with the community, we did an exhibition at the Mastillache, Musée Amérindien de Mastillache. And, you know, we just basically showed the different perspectives and the way in which the river was inhabited by different families. But one site, for me, was really, I guess for all of us research partners, was really turned our heads about how to think about the loss of heritage sites through industrial development, whether it's hydroelectric or any other kind of development, is that in its territorial negotiation right now, the community is involved in a global land claims, la politique de revendication globale. And they have chosen this site, but they didn't choose it because it was as one of the main cultural sites that they've identified within the negotiation. And people have said, well, you can't choose that, it's in front of a dam. You know, you can't, as though in their territorial negotiation, you know, now if there's this development, if the site isn't kind of pristine as a cultural site, like, you know, the Cree couldn't have identified Lupition in their land claims because it's no longer a cultural site because supposedly there's a dam. So we had this discussion when we were talking, and people were saying, well, no, it is still a cultural site. This used to be the same way that Lupition was, because of the heads of river, the way that the rivers converge. People would gather here at the end of the summer. The families would meet, and then they would get, you know, provisions, and then also leave in different parts of the territory following along the rivers. But what was also interesting that I didn't come across, although if we had looked at more sites in James Bay, of course we would have come across the same thing. This was a particularly important site because people referred to it as a door between the two worlds, the living and the dead. Apparently in this, so you have the gathering site here, the forks. Here there is a rocky outcropping here, and there is a kind of a bend in the rock that people refer to as le cran. And they would say that the ancestors would come out through this, what functioned like a door, and in Innu, the reference, these characters are the Katimaweshu, or Katimaseshu, there's different pronunciations for it, but these characters, you always see them from the side, because if you see them from the front, it means you're dead, right? So when the ancestors come back on the land, you can only see, if you see them, you will only see them from the side. So this is an artist in Mastillache who is represented the Katimaweshu as a really elongated figure, and generally you just see him. He's made many sculptures where you see like there's only one line, they only have one dimension. But this was a site, a very important, so cultural site, but spiritual, the immaterial heritage was very strong there too. People would come and in the hope of seeing their ancestors. So it had this dimension also when people gathered there in the summer. And we interviewed different people who told us about the importance of that site, but this one woman, she's in her early 30s. She's not an elder who's known the land, you know, in the past and all that. She's someone relatively young, and I kept it in French because she gave her testimony in French. But when she describes that site, she says, j'ai trouvé ça triste parce que quand même, c'est pas grand-chose, c'est de la roche. She said, it's not much, it's just rock. Pour d'autres personnes, c'est juste un cran, mais c'était quand même une référence avec les autres générations. Le cran, tu le vois plus, il n'y a plus de Katima ou échoue, ça ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y a plus de références traditionnelles. So there's a real sense that, you know, there are things that are just embedded in the landscape. They're not necessarily objects that you can take and bring to the museum. There's a, you know, heritage is territorial. It's located in the sites. And when you think about development of any sort, you know, this has to be reflected upon very carefully, the portability of heritage for people, or at least to offer the opportunities if they want to create other traces of that heritage, immaterial or otherwise. Where should it, what place should it have? Should it be on the land? Should it be in a museum? Should it be, you know, that site really posed these questions for us, saying that, you know, are we going to go back there and we want to organize a gathering there again with the band council? So that's what we're working on right now, to try to, you know, not just leave these things sort of in the research papers and all that. So I'll finish with what these things are sort of pointing out to us, and the work that we're continuing to do here with my students. This is the Manicouagan River. My colleague, nice kind of alliance between physical and cultural geographers. He's done a mapping of the old bed of the Manicouagan River. So we have the flooded river, but we have the line of the old river as it was before. So we're using this to kind of recreate a little bit what are the sites that are important. And there is more and more, I guess, like the idea that's come through this research. This is one of my students, Justine Gagnon, who's doing this project. Basically, the point of departure for her research is that in creating these spaces of visibility, the tourism landscape, and, you know, of course, the grandiose spectacle of the dance and all that, you also create spaces of invisibility. So commemorating, you know, the modernity of Quebecois through those landscapes, you invisibilize, of course, other cultural kinds of relationship with that land. And paradoxically, I guess what we're finding working with people around these practices of memory and representation is that the destruction of these landscapes generates memories, you know, even more. You know, people really want to find ways of documenting and archiving some of these sites. But it leads also to alternative engagements with these sites, with these emotional geographies, and we're looking for ways of thinking creatively about how to preserve a trace of these sites, but and make it accessible for people, but in a way that generates a meaningful engagement for them. So I guess the question is always, I mean, I keep interacting with Hydroquebec, trying to see if there's a possibility of developing more of a multi-voice commemoration of these hydroelectric landscapes. And we have different ideas around that, but I'm not sure how successful we'll be, but we're working on it. So I guess the idea is to move toward a multi-voice commemoration of these new ways of seeing and these new landscapes that have emerged as a result of hydroelectric development. So thank you for your attention, and maybe I should go back to the beginning. I wanted to go back to the beginning because this is a Cree memorial for the ancestors that were flooded as a result of the creation of the reservoirs. But that's, when you do the Hydroquebec tour, they mention it, but they don't take you to it. So the idea is that eventually you go. Yeah. Well, thank you for...
Thank you.
Maybe I'll sit now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Do people have questions for Caroline? If so, feel free. Go ahead.
Je me demandais juste les images où il y avait les Inuits qui, je trouve, faisaient le mapping devant Manic 5. Je me demandais si est-ce que c'est un
Oui, c'est un film de Arthur Lamotte.
ouais.
Oui, exactement. Puis, en fait, je peux peut-être répondre en français puisque ça va.
Oui.
Je l'ai mis là, mais c'est sûr que ça amène d'autres problématiques et tout ça. Mais quand on a fait la visite de Manic 5, la première, quand on s'est assis devant s'est assis dans la salle, ils ont commencé la conférence. Ils ont dit, avant, il n'y avait que la rivière Manicouagan qui coulait jusqu'au fleuve Saint-Laurent. Donc, c'était une mauvaise mise en contexte pour un territoire qui était bien sûr un territoire inou. Puis bon, il ne faut pas chercher de midi à 14 heures là, pour aller dans les archives ou pour savoir, même regarder une revue de presse de cette époque-là. Les Inuits se sont opposés, tout ça. Donc, après la visite, je suis allée voir les guides. J'ai dit, est-ce que vous avez reçu une formation sur l'occupation du territoire par les Inuits? Ils ont dit, oui, on a eu un Inuit de Pessamit qui est venu, mais on nous a dit que de toute façon, les Inuits n'étaient pas dans cette région-là parce qu'ils sont plus sur la côte, dans le village de Pessamit, etc. Mais c'est très mal, c'est complètement ignorant de l'occupation culturelle, traditionnelle de ces territoires-là par les Inuits. Donc, je leur ai pointé le film d'Arthur Lamotte. So all they needed to do was to go get the film d'Arthur Lamotte and present it to these they were young students, right? And I didn't want to be too harsh on them. It's Hydroquebec's responsibility to have a script that is more in line with the history and the ethnography and the sources that exist. So they hadn't looked at that film. But in that film, the Innu hunters that have lost their hunting grounds are above the dam and they're looking at a map. You know, there's a map on the ground and they're comparing the map with what they're, you know, what is now in that site. Ça vaut la peine de voir ce film d'Arthur Lamotte, c'est très intéressant.
Parce qu'il y avait d'autres. J'ai fait mon mémoire de maîtrise sur Manic 5.
Oui, oui.
Mais j'avais pas tout regardé. En tout cas, je me souvenais pas de ça.
Oui.
Mais j'avais plus regardé son film. Il a neigé sur la mer.
Oui, il a neigé sur la mer.
La neige a fondu sur la Manicouagan ou il a neigé sur la Manicouagan?
Moi, je pense qu'il a neigé sur la Manicouagan.
Ok, je me mélange.
Oui.
Mais c'est qu'il, là-dedans, je pense que la seule, justement, mention, c'est au début, c'est avant qu'il fasse ces films-là. Puis c'est Gilles Vigneault qui joue le rôle qui travaille apparemment sur le barrage, puis qui est supposé être d'origine Innu. Puis qui mentionne, c'est le seul à peu près à mentionner qu'il y avait apparemment que l'inondation avait. Ça allait inonder en fait un cimetière Innu. Mais c'est le genre de choses qui. Moi, c'est la seule mention que j'avais trouvée où. Puis c'est dans de la fiction, donc c'était même pas dans
c'est de la fiction.
Pour cette époque-là, tellement que c'était pas.
Une fois, moi,
regardé dans les années 60.
Oui, puis c'était de la fiction, comme vous dites, c'était de la fiction. Mais il y a deux citations souvent que j'utilise. Je les ai pas mises parce que je parlais pas de la Manicouagan là, ici. Mais il y a quelques années, peut-être que Daniel était là. On avait fait le plan Nord en question avec Dialogue. Il y avait Raphaël Picard qui était là, puis qui était chef de Pessamit, qui éventuellement s'est retiré de la négociation des Inuits, tout ça. Puis we could talk about the whole territorial negotiation for the Inuit that as a result of the signing of James Bay and of the Quebec Agreement, they said, well, hey, you know, we had all this development on the rivers and bon. ça, c'est tout un autre dossier aussi à analyser pour bien comprendre le développement hydroélectrique dans la province. Mais Raphaël Picard avait dit, sans le Nitassinan, il n'y aurait pas eu de révolution tranquille. And without Nitassinan is the Innu term for the traditional, the larger territory, not the residential reserves and all that. The Nitassinan is the larger territory. Actually, these are each of the Nitassinan in the negotiation. This is l'EPOG, l'entente de principe d'ordre général. This is the map. This is no longer accurate because some communities have returned, but the Nitassinan is the larger territory. So basically he's saying without the Nitassinan, the Betsianit, there would not have been a quiet revolution. And, another person who says that is Louis-Edmond Hamelin. He says, what an absurdity that Jean Lesage pronounced maître chez nous in Innu territory. And, I guess at the time I think today people would have picked up on it, but at the time you can say you can be in the very heart of this Innu landscape and say maître chez nous, so Luc a fait un beau film là-dessus, Tente sur Mars, sur le, through relating to mining, but that constant reference maître chez nous, on est chez nous. Sur l'entièreté du territoire québécois is very, very, very pervasive. Yeah. And the toponymy is also, I guess we don't say that in English, place naming is a big part of that also. The franchising of a lot of yeah.
Je veux savoir, mais comme touriste, quand on va, moi je suis jamais allée,
Oui.
Qu'est-ce qu'on est. Quel est le discours qui est mis de l'avant? C'est pas du tout le discours que c'est un immense projet de colonisation des ressources. Là. Je veux dire, c'est un discours.
C'est assez surprenant quand même.
Ouais.
Oui, je ne sais pas s'il y a d'autres personnes qui sont allées.
Oui. À ce moment-là, c'était pas tant la question de nous que c'était le film, je pense, de Roy Dupuis qui venait de sortir sur les rivières. Puis, c'était comme la petite guide, elle nous disait. Ben, tu sais, l'eau, elle fait juste passer, elle n'est pas transformée, là. Elle n'a même pas le temps de se réchauffer, de changer de température. On fait absolument rien sur le pays, ben, sur la nature, finalement. C'est super écologique, un barrage, sans dire que, tu sais, des fois, l'inondation, ça peut quand même tuer des paysages et tout. Tout ce qui se trouve, là, en fait. Ça modifie, finalement.
Mais en même temps, je suis quand même assez critique du fait qu'on ne peut pas, tu sais, en anglais, you can't have your cake and eat it too, là. Tu sais, on participe tous à une surexploitation des ressources par notre consommation, tout ça. Fait qu'il faut être conséquent. On ne peut pas juste dire, mon Dieu, on en noie les territoires autochtones et quel dommage et tout ça. Je pense qu'il faut être conséquent dans nos actions aussi. Mais je dirais que la Manique, c'est la même chose aussi, mais c'est assez surprenant quand on va à la baie James, il faut célébrer les travailleurs. Tu sais, puis pour moi, je viens d'un milieu ouvrier, je me suis intéressée à la baie James parce que les gens autour de moi allaient à la baie James pour travailler. Donc en faisant ce travail-là, pour moi, il y avait toujours comme un conflit un petit peu parce que il y a bien des gens qui ont travaillé dur et fort, puis qu'il y avait des mauvaises conditions de travail dans les villes, qui étaient obligés de s'isoler à la baie James, tout ça. Il y a un très beau film de Pierre Perrault en Abitibi où il y a un député du Parti québécois qui dit « Nous autres, qu'est-ce qu'on était? On était moins que des Indiens, tu sais, les ouvriers, parce qu'il y avait encore moins de respect, tu sais. » Fait que quand on va à la baie James, je vois les travailleurs, il y a un site qui honore les pionniers, qui n'est pas d'Hydroquebec, mais d'un autre. Puis, je suis allée à plusieurs reprises, puis tu vois les gens qui reviennent avec leurs enfants, leurs familles, pour dire, tu sais, j'ai bâti ça, j'ai fait ça. Fait que, you have to keep in balance Aboriginal politics, but also class politics and racial politics. So, in my book, I hope I've been careful enough to show that, it's not the way to go and damn, that's the word, to damn the workers for doing what they did. This was a particular economic context where these people thought they were doing the right thing and they needed a job. Yeah.
Moi, je ne suggère pas ça du tout, là. C'est plutôt que je me demandais si un touriste là pouvait aller justement avoir accès à ces différentes histoires-là, ces différents points de vue.
Le point de
Mais c'est
vue
un
des
discours.
Cris ou des Autochtones?
Des cris, aussi du travailleur. Je veux dire, c'est complexe,
Ouais.
cette histoire-là, finalement. Je veux dire, c'est complexe. C'est pas juste un projet, oui, c'est un projet d'exploitation de la nature, mais ça va plus loin que ça. C'est lié à... J'adore cette image quand
Ouais.
c'était décolonisant, on colonisait, et puis plus on se
Ouais,
décolonise.
Ouais. Ben, ce qui
Québec,
était...
plus
Ouais. Mais on n'a pas voulu préserver, il y avait toutes sortes d'infrastructures de travailleurs qui auraient pu être préservées, hein, les camps de travailleurs, tu sais, la fameuse cafétéria, parce que aussi quand on regarde ça du point de vue des femmes, les femmes étaient, il y avait une minorité, donc là, il y a quelque chose de très fort là, au niveau des relations entre hommes et femmes, tu sais, dans un site où, tu sais, elle parlait de s'en aller avec leur cabaret, puis elle avait toujours peur d'échapper ça, qu'il y avait 300 paires d'hommes, de yeux d'hommes qui les regardaient. Donc, il y a eu des sites qui auraient... Tu sais, on a... La gloire des travailleurs, c'est juste les cathédrales hydroélectriques qu'ils ont produites. Alors que où ça se vivait vraiment, c'était aussi les infrastructures, tu sais, le camp des travailleurs, les petites maisons, il y aurait eu beaucoup de patrimoine à
C'est comme en
préserver.
Alberta, puis les sables bitumineux, il y a la même...
Tout à fait. Tout à fait, oui. C'est des zones de frontières. Oui, oui.
Il y a des sites intéressants à visiter pour faire un lien avec votre question. Je suis déjà allé dans cette région-là. Puis le site de Fort George que tu as mentionné tout à l'heure, effectivement, ça c'est un site très intéressant à visiter parce que dans la région de Radisson, le tourisme est dominé par l'idéologie d'Hydro-Québec. Moi, j'ai trouvé que c'est très... nous avons réussi, nous avons accompli des choses, et il n'y a pas de pollution, oubliez ça, il n'y a pas de pollution, puis tout le monde va bien. Je trouve qu'ils ils ont une approche positiviste qui est presque dérangeante, mais quand tu t'en vas à Fort George, on visite l'ancien site du village, puis là on se rend compte qu'ils ont été obligés de migrer depuis cette île-là jusqu'au continent, mais qu'en même temps ça les a reconnectés à la route, qui est un axe de développement important. Là, c'est toute l'histoire, là, je trouve, qui est bien imbriquée dans ce secteur-là. Puis c'est assez bien la visite qu'ils font là, avec une petite tasse de thé.
Ah oui. Ben, est-ce que vous êtes allé avec Margaret Cromarty et William?
Ils comptent des légendes et tout ça. Fait que, c'est bon. Après, tu as l'expérience un petit peu différente qui est bien à confronter avec l'expérience industrielle d'Hydro-Québec, je trouve.
Absolument. Puis, en fait, les gens, il y avait Daniel, un entrepreneur de tourisme, j'oublie son nom de famille, là, qui encourageait quand même les gens qui venaient voir Hydro-Québec, qui les encourageait à passer à Fort-Georges. Fait que, tu sais, je pense que c'est toute une autre perspective. Mais, tu sais, quand tu es rendu à LG1, tu peux le prendre, l'autobus d'Hydro-Québec, pour te rendre à LG1. Tu ferais de 20 km de plus, tu serais rendu à Fort-Georges. Mais la plupart des touristes vont pas le faire, ce qui est fort dommage, là, vraiment. Mais aussi la visite de... je ne sais pas si vous avez eu la même visite que moi, ça fait quand même quelques années, mais il y a un gars qui fait les visites depuis de nombreuses années. C'est un gars natif de Radisson. Moi, je suis allée au moins 4 reprises, puis au fil des années, il grisonnait, mais c'est encore lui la prochaine fois. Il est né...
Le magasin Inou, le magasin d'art Inuit?
Non, ça, je parle de quelqu'un qui est alloctone, qui n'est pas cri, qui est né, ses parents étaient travailleurs à la baie James, puis ils sont restés. D'ailleurs, il y a un très beau film des Nouvelles du Nord sur les gens qui, finalement, sont restés à Radisson. Mais encore là, moi, j'arrive avec mon regard très critique sur le paysage hydroélectrique, puis la colonisation, tout ça. Puis il y a ce gars-là qui est né à Radisson, c'est son lieu, il a grandi là, il est très correct avec les Autochtones aussi. Puis c'est lui qui s'occupe de la visite d'Hydro-Québec. Tu sais, c'est vraiment des trajectoires de vie assez complexes, là. Donc, je pense que, tu sais, pour faire le travail que j'ai voulu faire, je voulais en rester au niveau des discours politiques, puis de la construction de ce regard-là, puis la production de la route et de nommer les paysages sans s'intéresser à ce que les Autochtones nommaient, comment ils nommaient, tout ça, je trouve ça vraiment incroyable parce que on aurait toute une autre manière de voir le territoire si on lisait ces sites-là d'un point de vue autochtone quand on prend la route de la baie James, là. Il aurait suffi d'engager 2 ou 3 chasseurs les mettre dans la voiture avec Monsieur Laverdière, puis ça aurait été... so, yeah, there's a lot of... Yeah.
Tu as parlé de ton travail à la commission de toponymie. Je suis curieux, j'aimerais savoir comment tes travaux sont reçus. C'est quand même un organisme assez gouvernemental, assez conservateur. Tes travaux mettent en relief l'effacement de la présence autochtone, l'invisibilisation un peu de la présence autochtone.
Oui.
Comment est-ce que les gens de la commission de toponymie réagissent? Comment l'État, finalement, réagit face à ce que tu mets en relief? Et est-ce qu'il y a un désir de corriger ça? Est-ce qu'il y a un désir de dire, oh oui, c'est vrai, on a été fautif dans le temps, et il n'est pas impossible maintenant de renommer les endroits, de redonner les noms autochtones, et en fait de redonner la saveur autochtone créée selon les endroits qui existait à l'origine.
Ouais.
Est-ce que tu vois que ça peut arriver, ça, mais si c'est pas
Excellente
du tout dans les
question.
cartes?
Ça prendra encore une heure de présentation, mais je vais essayer de répondre rapidement. Ben, c'est drôle, je suis dans une très, on pourrait dire une mauvaise posture à la commission de toponymie parce qu'en étant commissaire, je vois très bien comment ça fonctionne au niveau de la politique du gouvernement, que de cette manière de jouer sur la mémoire, de rendre invisible ou de rendre visible, dépendant des volontés politiques. Donc, c'est un laboratoire incroyable pour une géographe culturelle d'être capable de voir ça, comment ça évolue vraiment dans le pratico-pratique. Mais en même temps, j'ai un devoir de réserve et de confidentialité. Fait que je ne peux pas du tout, parler des documents. Mais ce que je dirais, par contre, il y a des analystes qui sont extrêmement compétents à la commission. Et là où c'est extrêmement conservateur. Il faut apprendre à tout le monde qu'on n'est plus dans le Québec des années 60. On n'est plus dans une perspective où on a le droit de tout nommer, puis il faut conserver le caractère français. Tu n'as jamais mis les pieds à la baie James ou au Nunavik, là, mais tu te penses au Québec, mais là, le jour où tu mettras les pieds, là, tu vas voir que c'est une autre réalité. Fait que ça il faut toujours travailler dans les réunions à développer une grammaire multiculturelle par rapport à ce que c'est que notre territoire québécois, qu'on habite ensemble, les ressources, tout ça. Fait que ça, moi, mon rôle, puis on a, tu sais, à la commission de toponymie, notre plus vieux commissaire en ce moment, je pense qu'il a 86 ans. Fait que je me dis, il me reste au moins, je sais pas, 40 ans à travailler pourvu que je puisse continuer d'entendre et de voir, là, parce que, bon. Mais donc, c'est un travail de longue haleine que je pense que je vais faire pendant plusieurs années, mais qui demande des interventions très patientes, très respectueuses et très, mais quand même bien appuyées. Mais par contre, je dirais que ce qui m'épate, c'est surtout au niveau des analystes, ils ont toute une boîte à outils. Hein? Au début, là, c'était non, la double toponymie, ça n'existe pas, c'est dangereux pour la sécurité, puis ces choses-là. Puis lorsque je fais parce que je fais des modèles de comparaison avec comment ça se fait en Colombie-Britannique, en Nouvelle-Zélande, en Australie, quand on arrive avec des modèles de comparaison, tout d'un coup, c'est tu sais, puis il y a la Commission de toponymie du Canada aussi qui sont très, très proches, mais le contexte québécois est vraiment particulier à cause de la Charte de la langue française. La Commission de toponymie relève de la Charte de la langue française. Fait que ça, c'est tout un défi. Il faut opérer, on est un des organes de la Charte de la langue, de l'Office de la langue française. Donc, il faut opérer dans ce cadre-là, mais moi, ma mission, c'est vraiment de multiplier les exemples de comparaison de façon à ce qu'on développe notre boîte à outils. Puis c'est pas demain matin qu'on va dire non, tel lac s'appelle plus comme ça, on redonne le nom Inuit tout de suite. Mais on va peut-être prendre des mesures graduelles pour avoir... Mais bon, je vais finir avec la dernière chose, c'est que aussi, une de mes stratégies, on a tenu une journée sur la toponymie autochtone il y a 1 an. Presque toutes les nations étaient représentées. Donc, on crée des liens pour que les gens se connaissent de part et d'autre. Et donc, moi aussi, ce que j'essaie de faire, c'est là, on va créer une boîte à outils pour outiller les communautés. D'ailleurs, c'est le dialogue, j'en ai parlé à Carole. Outiller les communautés pour qu'elles sachent comment proposer des dossiers à la commission de toponymie pour la reconnaissance et la valorisation, sinon l'officialisation de leur nom. Donc, c'est d'y aller dans les stratégies, dans les actions concrètes que les gens peuvent faire. Puis si ça s'inscrit dans tout l'arbre décisionnel de la commission de toponymie, on ne peut pas refuser de redonner un nom. Mais donc, en tout cas, c'est de développer de manière très concrète les stratégies. Mais, donc, c'est ça. Je vais continuer d'être comme ça, mais des fois, c'est comme, OK, il ne faut pas...
Est-ce que les communautés autochtones font pression pour changer les choses?
Ben, c'est comme, moi, personnellement, là, je trouve qu'il y aurait beaucoup plus de représentation à faire. Certaines le font. Certaines ont vraiment des projets. Les Cris, les Inuits, les Inuits ont des projets de toponymie très, très développés. Mais l'arrimage n'est peut-être pas encore tout à fait... on ne s'est pas tout attaché au niveau de comment soumettre leur dossier. Fait que moi, je me vois un peu comme un genre de pont entre les communautés, là, pour qu'ils soient bien, qu'ils aient toujours une personne à qui s'adresser, puis qui... ouais. Mais comme je dis, à 85 ans, là, je vais sûrement être encore là. si j'écris pas d'autres articles comme celui dont je vous ai parlé. C'est ça.
So, when you visit these places,
Yeah.
do you go in summer or
Yeah,
in summer?
well, you know, I've found, well, it depends on the different places, but I find that when you go see Inuit communities, whether it's summer or winter, in the summer there's all the fog, so you know when you get there, you don't know when you leave. In the winter, there's depending on the different communities I'm working with, I don't just do field work in the summer. I can go at different times, but recently working with Master Yash, it's about 3 hours from Quebec, so they come to Quebec, we go to Master Yash, so it's much easier.
By car? You go by car?
To Master Yash, to James Bay, yes, if I have more time. But for the Inuit, I haven't been to Nunavik in a few years now, but But recently, all the North Shore or Hydroquebec sites are accessible by, not all the North Shore, but the Manicouagan and all that, that's all accessible by road. Yeah. But that's a problem with, I'll say quickly, sometimes I envy my anthropologist colleagues because they pick one community and they become, a specialist. When you're in geography and you're the one geography professor who is, working with Aboriginal people, then I work with probably 10 different, and we work with urban Aboriginal people as well. So there's lots, you don't have necessarily one field site that you're constantly going to. But, yeah.